This is still the conversation, and of course we're exploring issues around the protest in Kenya. Now, at this point, we will be looking beyond just Kenya right now, but the impact this, might have had, across the African continent, talking about other countries. And to make sense of this, I'm joined on the program by Alex Wati. Is actually a social economic commentator and political analyst from Kenya. And also Tham San Kwazu is an African affairs analyst from UK. Gentlemen, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having us.
All right, let me start off with you, Alex. I mean, this particular protest saw young people who, of course, the brand name that, or the generic name, umbrella name that, they were given is the Gen Z Kenyans, come out on the street, with a strong voice, united, with one cause. And at the end of the day, to a large extent, you would want to say that that voice resounded and was even able to influence, the president to reverse a particular, a decision which affected everybody. What does this say about the future of the young generation in Africa? I'd like your opinion on this, Alex.
One of the things that is not in question or in debate is the fact that the population of Africa is essentially people who are under the age of 35. In the Kenyan context, we call them the youth, anybody below the age of 35. It's about 70 to 80%. And these people now have reached an age where they can influence things, they understand, they are educated, very, very educated. They are very, very well connected in the social media. And so that no one can ignore them. You've seen what has happened in Senegal in the election of the current president. It's the same young generation saying, we have a stake in Africa and please give us our space. And that has resoundingly been done in Kenya.
Let me get the opinion of Tham in this. I mean, we saw something quite similar happen in Nigeria, for instance, which, of course, the NSAS protest that saw a lot of young individuals, young persons come out in mass, to challenge not just police brutality, but also the governance issues across the country. Even though at the end of the day, the eventual outcomes are pretty much almost different. One thing is sure, it appears like the young generation are not sleeping anymore. Do you share that line of thought?
Well, thank you for having me again, Dapo. Well, I would like to believe that Kenya is very different. The NSAS protests, probably in the manner that they were held, they galvanized the youth, but in Nigeria in particular, there were a lot of celebrities, especially musicians, that came out in support of what was happening. That is not so much of the issue in Kenya. It appears that most of these Gen Z, probably what you might call the normal young people, the youth, like what Alex is saying, on the just coming to the streets, galvanizing themselves and organizing themselves through social media, TikTok and other social media platforms. But I think we need to be very careful. Kenya is very different, is very particular. Kenya has a history of political violence. So new, in fact, that President Ruto himself was at one point being dragged to the Hague over political violence that had happened during that election that ended up with former President, the late Mwai Kibaki, staying in power, including former President Uhuru Kenyatta as well. So my reading is that even when you look before the latest announcement by President Ruto, when he said he's going to withdraw that finance bill, there were concessions that were done before, over the 16% VAT and others. So when these protests were happening, the Ruto administration, it would appear, was very, very cautious because they didn't want to do anything that could bring violence to the streets of Kenya, because once there is that violence, you cannot ignore what has happened in the past. So I think we shouldn't read too much into the response by the Ruto administration to the pressure being put by the protests and what happened, the violence and the unfortunate and sad and tragic deaths that we witnessed, to equate that to what might happen in other parts of Africa. I think the situation is different. Kenya, political violence is something that, is very sensitive, very, very sensitive. And that history informs how they behave. Back to you, Babu.
Okay, I'm still going to stay with you. So are there, takeaways from this event for other African countries?
I'm not so sure. I think the major takeaway is more to do with the politics of Kenya and what President Ruto has tried to do. Because in conceding and pulling back, it is an effort to try and keep the country together, try to avoid having violence that he might fail to control. And then the second one is that probably for Kenya, the parliamentary democracy has been defeated by the Gen Z, I would say. Because what's the point of voting for an MP who should represent you in parliament over these votes if the streets are going to simply say, we don't like how these MPs in the majority have voted, we are not going to accept the result of a parliamentary vote. So I think it's going to change the politics of Kenya, the dynamics within Kenya. How is Parliament, the power of Parliament has been transferred to the streets and the social media. So how then will you, operate going forward? Because most of these MPs, when they go back to their constituencies, they've lost the power. And I think that is why they were rounding up around the president. But it's very clear that when he sends it back to Parliament, Kenya will still need a budget. They need the finance bill. What kind of finance bill will they have? The MPs no longer have that authority because Gen Z can always organize again. Probably some politicians or would-be politicians might take advantage of what has been this vacuum that has been created, and they might put more pressure. So you might end up having a big parliamentary or maybe constitutional crisis in Kenya as a result of the power that has been handed over to protesters as opposed to parliamentarians deciding what laws and the budget, the finance bill in particular. It has to be solved within the next 2 weeks.
All right, let me leave you for a moment, Tham. Let me go to Alex on this one. Now, Alex, what are takeaways for you, for other African nations? And do you think, just borrowing the words of Tham here, that the power of Parliament has been transferred to the streets and social media, given what we saw happen, in the course of the week, just yesterday at the Parliament?
It's important to clear the air to say that Kenya has had a very good share of violence, political violence in the past, all the way from the time that we gained independence. And that this became even more worse when we became multi-party democracy around 1992. And you've had that in every cycle of election, there has always been political violence. And what has happened is that in the past is that demonstrators have gone to the streets and tried to stop the whole system, close down businesses, and in most instances even loot shops, and those violence from day one. We have seen a complete shift of that in this one, that this is totally different. It's not about party, it's not about tribe, it's not about region, it's about finance bill. And in my opinion, the finance bill was a trigger of something that was already shimmering within the young people in Kenya. So basically there's a shift in which they're saying, look, we've got to be listened to, because you as our representatives have to be able to listen to us before you make any decision. The unfortunate thing that the government that has Ruto's government in the past 2 years that they have been in power, they have reached a point where they no longer consider even when others are suggesting, because some of us have been talking about the draconian bill, not because we are pro or against the government, but raising the fact that this has happened. So for me, what has shifted is the thinking that a few people can sit somewhere and be able to make decisions without considering the opinions of others. It must be said here that various organizations, we have the Federation of Kenya Employers, we have the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, we have the churches, we have people, various people had gone to do the presentations of their own to either parliament or in various forums to question some of these taxes. And the government kept saying, we must tax you to be able to pay the debt that is there, meaning that they were not listening. Now, this, for me, is so critical that that has shifted a bit, that any person who is elected as a member of parliament going forward, or anybody who is elected as a representative, whether he's what we call the member of county assemblies in the lower level of government, or members of parliament, or members of senate, now will have to be listening to the people that they represent before they go and pretend that they can be able to tell them what is right. That shift has happened.
All right.
There's also issue of this whole issue of what this could portend. Remember, young people are watching from everywhere. And one of the dangerous things is to be dismissive in the fact that because this country has had this level of violence, then obviously this is a once-off and it will not affect others. In Kenya, and I don't know whether it's happening in other countries, the X is full of posters from about 5 African countries. And I'm just hoping that these posters are really just created entirely, because young people in Kenya are very creative. They could be creating some propaganda of some sort. But there are many of them, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Ghana, and I think even Uganda, they have set dates by which they will go to the parliament. Others have said they are going to shut down the country. That young people are doing the same thing in other countries. I'm just hoping that these are just propaganda, not reality on the ground. But others, if that propaganda can spread, it could pick up.
All right. I'm still going to stay with you, Alex. I mean, we are seeing across regions in Africa where young people particularly, are beginning to, in a way, challenge the political status quo. I mean, Tham made reference to, I think it was you or Tham that made reference to the fact that in some countries right now you have young leaders, even though they're military leaders, some of them are beginning to sort of take over. But my question to you is this: what kind of awakening would you say is happening across the African continent, especially when it comes to discontent of the people? I mean, since the COVID-19 pandemic, where we've seen governments being toppled, we've seen protests against policies across board. We've seen people, being vocal to their governments, particularly as regards the cost of living and certain policies they feel are anti-people. I'd like to know your take exactly. Do you think that this could have some sort of Western influence, or it's purely a product of people venting their aggression to the system?
There's obviously a feeling within African context, and especially the young people, that we are where we are because of the policies that have been taken there before, and mainly from the colonial powers that be, that they really just led physically, but they didn't leave economically, that they're still the ones who are holding. That on the 28th, the Gen Zs have put up a notice that they'll be storming the IMF and World Bank offices in Nairobi, and they're saying we'll no longer be your slaves anymore. So there's a sense in which, and when you look at Senegal, there's the same argument. When you look at, I think it's Burkina Faso, it's the same argument. So there's an argument around that we need to rule ourselves and not have puppets that rule over us for the benefit of the colonial masters. That is a serious issue, and that, I think, it's in most of the African countries, especially for the young people. They are not ignorant of the fact that they are struggling, and their struggles, and human beings, when they struggle, they always look for a scapegoat, whether real or imagined. But in this case, they're looking at the West and everybody else that has been terrorizing them economically by taking charge of economic situation in Africa. And of course, the thinking is that the leadership that is there has been placed there for the benefit of the colonialists.
I'd like to direct the same question to Tham too. Tham, what exactly do you think is going on? Do you foresee a situation where people are being vocal, genuinely against what they consider unfair by the system, or just some sort of Western influence across board?
No, I believe, history will indicate that youth in Africa in particular have always been very politically active. You look at the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, it was, most of the people that were fighting, that were taking to the streets, that were, rising up against the apartheid system were young people, including, the Machininis and, that 1976 uprising, the Sharpeville and all that. In Zimbabwe, most of the people that fought in the liberation war that liberated Zimbabwe were predominantly young people. Some of the ministers that you have now in the government in Zimbabwe went to join the war when they were 15 and 16, that young. So you've always had the young people. If you look at the generation of the 80s, the Thomas Sankaras and all that, there were still very young people at the time, and they were, running governments. And even now, this generation that you have in Kenya and other places, people like President Ruto, he's very young now, when you look at the average age of most of the leaders across the world, but look how long he has been in politics. So he went into politics when he was still young. So but I think what we are seeing now is we've got social media, we've got more exposure, we've got more connectedness. What happens in one part of the continent today is felt and discussed and watched by others in another part almost at the same time. So what I believe is happening now is there is more visibility of what is going on as opposed to an increase in the level. In actual fact, I would think that there's less activity by young people now compared to what used to happen in the past. Most of the changes in governments and uprisings and, the radical transformation that you saw in a lot of countries was led by young people and in large numbers. Now we are talking about what happened in Senegal that resulted in the, political transformation in terms of the election results. And SARS in Nigeria did not translate to maybe a change of government to maybe Peter Obi and Labour and others that said they were representing young people and other candidates that put themselves forward as the youth. You still had APC, President Tinubu, winning. So there are areas where this kind of pressure will translate to political outcomes that favor probably a new particular party. Who knows? I mean, Omar Obama might end up being, a president in Kenya, uplifted by young people. So we don't know what's going to happen. But I'm always careful in reading what happens before the eggs can hatch.
All right. I'll still stay on you just quickly in 30 seconds. How much of impact do you think this particular protest, may have on the Ruto administration?
Huge. It is massive. Like I said, the Ruto administration has lost power to the streets. So the next time when they bring any form of legislation, the Gen Z will feel emboldened to go and oppose it because the administration carries a risk because they have the responsibility to make sure that there's a country that has infrastructure, that has service delivery, public services, hospitals that run, transport that runs, schools and everything else. They know what their obligations are. But someone on the streets is not necessarily going to be, aware of what the obligations of government are in their interest, which is why you normally have a parliament that has to consult the constituencies and come back to parliament and then debate. So now I think it's going to be very difficult going forward, very, very difficult. The impact of this particular protest or movement or campaign by the Jay-Z in Kenya is game-changing in the politics of Kenya.
All right. Just also your opinion on this to Alex, quickly.
Tomorrow they have set up a timetable to go and have 1 million people march. And I've just seen some communications on X that's saying that they are still on. So I think based on that, we'll know what happens tomorrow, because the 1 million march was really to go to State House in Nairobi. The bottom line is, of course, now power is to the people. I believe that they will not be able to protest every time that something comes up. But the government will have to be very careful in the parliament, and the executive have to be very careful in terms of the decisions they make going forward, so that they don't create the same rage and anger that they have created in the young people at this particular time. I think if they watch that, things will work.
All right. Thank you so much for your contribution on the program today. Alex and Tham, once again, I appreciate you. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
All right.
Most welcome.